The selection bell rang before dawn, and Wynne was already awake. She had not slept. She had sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the holding house and pressed her fingertips against the crack in the plaster wall. The same crack she had traced each night for 3 weeks, memorizing it the way one memorizes an exit route, a familiar thing to hold when everything else was moving. Outside, the torches in the great yard of Valdenmere Keep had burned all night, and their light had come through the gap in the shutter in one long orange stripe across the stone floor, and she had watched it travel as the hours turned and tried without success to feel anything other than a careful, comprehensive readiness. In her pack, a canvas bag with a broken buckle she had mended herself with cord from a kitchen drawer, was almost nothing. A folded square of linen that had been her grandmother's, the hemline worn thin at one corner from decades of fingers seeking it out in the dark, and a small iron comb with 3 tines missing that she had carried since the morning her grandmother died, and she had picked it up from the floor without thinking, something to hold, and had not put it down since. These were the things she had kept across 7 moves in 5 years. Everything else had been sold or left or taken by someone who considered it their right to take things. The selection was not a choice. She had not chosen to come here. Her father had chosen it for her, in the way he chose most things. Quickly, and in exchange for something he needed more than he needed her. The debt had been significant. The buyer had not cared what she wanted. And now, at 22, she stood among 43 other women in the great forecourt of the Northern Keep, with her hair braided too tightly because the women who prepared them had not asked how she liked it, and her hands folded in front of her in a posture that looked like patience, and was actually the way she stopped herself from cataloguing exits. There were 12 exits from the forecourt. She had counted them before she stopped counting. The Alpha King would walk among them. That was how the Northern Rite worked. He would move through the line, his wolf instinct reading what his human eyes could not, until the recognition happened, or it didn't. Most selections produced no match. The women were thanked, escorted to the road, sent home with a silver coin and no explanation. In 4 centuries, the rite had produced a match only 7 times. And no one in this line expected to be chosen. They had been brought here as hope maintained at scale, a bureaucratic optimism that didn't require any individual woman to actually believe. Wynne did not believe. What she believed in was the wall at her back, cold, real, northern limestone, and the pale light beginning to surface over the eastern ridge, and the smell of pine smoke from the kitchen chimneys, that reminded her, obscurely and against her will, of the hill behind her grandmother's house, where the winter thyme grew in the cracks between the stones, and you could sit in the late autumn wind and feel briefly like a person who did not need to be anything at all. She was still young enough to mourn that hill. She was old enough to understand that mourning it was useful to no one, and changed nothing. She was also, though this had never been mentioned to her as though it mattered, genuinely and precisely beautiful. Dark auburn hair, the colour of river clay in firelight, that she wore braided, but that was, when unpinned, remarkable in its weight and depth. Skin the tone of winter honey, flushed now at the cheekbones from the cold and from the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to be ready in rooms that might require it. Eyes that were a dark amber green, the colour of lichen in shade, that moved across a room with an efficiency that most people misread as wariness, and that was, in fact, simply attention. She noticed things the way a craftsman notices flaws in material, not from distrust, but from training. Her jaw was clean and her mouth was serious, and she stood in the borrowed wool gown with the self-erasure of a person who has spent years making herself small, which paradoxically gave her the stillness of someone impossible to ignore. A man searching for something lost tends to recognize it, not by how loud it is, but by how precisely it fits the shape of the absence. She was the exact shape of what had been missing. She was thinking of the time hill when the Alpha King, Caelindor, came through the iron gate. She had heard stories. Everyone had heard stories. She had expected something theatrical. A man who announced himself with size and gravity, whose presence preceded him into a room the way cold precedes a storm. What came through the gate was quieter than that. He was tall, yes, and broad in the way of men who have lived in their bodies for centuries, without ever learning to be careless with them. His hair was dark, close-cropped at the sides, and his eyes, when they moved across the line, were the particular grey of the sky just before it decides what kind of weather it will be. He wore no crown. He wore what appeared to be a working officer's coat, heavy, dark, unadorned, and boots that had seen real ground. A scar ran along the outer edge of his right hand, from the knuckle of his smallest finger to the wrist, the kind of scar that happens once and does not explain itself. He walked slowly. The women at the far end of the line straightened as he neared them, some with hope, some with terror. Gaitu, with the particular bright fixedness of women who had decided in advance that they would be selected if they simply wanted it hard enough. He moved past them without pausing. Wynne watched him come. She was not thinking about being chosen. She was thinking, with a clarity she would later find embarrassing, that his coat had been mended at the right shoulder, a careful, competent repair that someone had done with dark thread that did not quite match, and that he had not had it redone, and that this detail seemed important in a way she could not name. She was still thinking about it when he stopped in front of her. He did not look the way she expected him to look when he looked at her. There was no ceremony in it. He simply stopped. And then something in his expression shifted. The way a word surfaces in a language you had almost forgotten you once spoke. And she saw in his face the specific quality of a man whose body has arrived at a conclusion that his mind has not yet been informed of. His eyes, she noticed, had gone gold, not the grey of before. Gold, lit from within, the way embers glow when wind finds them. She held very still. He said nothing for a long moment. His wolf, she understood later, was already certain. His human self was still catching up, across 4 centuries of learned caution. Then he said quietly, as if he were saying it to himself rather than to her, "I'll take this one." The words moved through the line like a cold current. The woman 2 places to Wynne's left made a sound she stifled immediately. The court official, standing at the gate, made a note on his parchment. With the mechanical detachment of a man who had waited 4 decades for this moment and was determined not to react to it. And Wynne looked at the Alpha King, at Caelindor, ancient and serious and entirely unreadable, and felt a very specific and practical thing, which was, "This is the worst thing my father has ever done to me." She was wrong, but she would need 3 months to understand that fully. The road to Holnmark took 3 days. She travelled with a small escort, in a covered cart fitted with a sleeping pallet, and on the second night of the journey the escort stopped at a posting inn, and she was brought inside and given a room. She ate the meal that was brought without tasting it, and then sat on the edge of the bed, and took out the linen square and held it, and then took out the iron comb and held that too, and sat with both in her hands in the fire-lit room and thought about the time hill and about her grandmother, who had taught her the names of plants and the uses of roots and the specific look of soil that was hiding something edible just below the surface, and who had died leaving behind an iron comb and a hemmed square of linen and a house that was sold within a season. She was not crying. She was simply being still with the things that were still hers. as a way of confirming that she existed and that she was traveling towards something rather than only away from what was behind her. She was not certain what she was traveling toward. She was fairly certain about what she was leaving. The castle was called Holnmark, and it was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something oppressive, a castle built to contain things, with narrow passages and doors that only locked from one side. She had been sent here by a man who locked things. She had expected his architecture, in the architecture of the place that claimed her. Holnmark was old in a way that had grown gentle with it. The corridors were wide, the ceilings vaulted, the stone worn smooth at hand height on both sides of every passage from centuries of hands passing. The windows in her room were large, and they faced south and east, which meant she woke each morning to actual light. Not the orange stripe from a cracked shutter, but real daylight, grey-white and full, filling the room before she was ready for it. There was a desk, a chair by the hearth, a wardrobe with empty shelves that were not empty for long, because 3 days after her arrival, household woman brought folded garments and hung them without explanation or commentary, as if it were simply understood that she would need them. The door had a lock. The key had been laid on the bedside table without comment, and when she picked it up the first night and turned it, she found that the bolt engaged on the inside. She sat with that for a long time. She did not understand rooms that locked from the inside. She had lived in rooms where the lock, if there was one, existed to keep her in. She tested the bolt twice, pressing the pad of her thumb against it, feeling the clean engagement of the mechanism. Then she set the key back on the table and lay down and stared at the ceiling and felt something she did not have a name for yet, which was the specific disorientation of safety offered without condition. She decided it was a trick and went to sleep. The first week passed like that, careful and quiet, two people learning not to startle each other. She was brought meals, good ones, and no one commented on how much she ate. She was shown the library, the south garden, the kitchen corridor, where she could request anything from the cooks without routing through a page. A schedule appeared on her door, not of obligations, but of availabilities. When the library was staffed, when the garden had its warmest hours, when the great hall would be empty, if she preferred empty halls. She did prefer empty halls. Whoever had made the schedule had known that without asking. She placed the iron comb on the windowsill each morning in the same position, a habit she had developed in other houses, when knowing whether things had been moved in her absence was information she needed. The comb stayed where she placed it, every day. She noticed the pattern of its staying, the way she noticed most reliable things, quietly, without letting herself trust it, filing it for later. There was a chess set in the library, arranged mid-game on a table near the east window. She did not touch it. She looked at it. When she passed, with the attention she gave to all objects that told her something about who lived here. The game had been abandoned by both players at a genuinely contested position, and the dust on the pieces was even, which meant neither side had been moved for long enough that dust no longer distinguished between them. She did not know who the second player had been. She gathered from the singular quality of the castle's solitude that there had not been one for some time. Caelindor himself she rarely saw in those first days. He crossed her path twice in the corridor, once with a group of his council, once alone, carrying what appeared to be a surveying roll under his arm, and both times he acknowledged her with a brief nod that managed somehow to not feel perfunctory. He looked at her the way she had noticed very few people ever looked at her, which was directly, with complete attention, as if she were the thing he was actually seeing rather than a surface to look past. She found it profoundly unsettling. On the fourth day, she discovered the library's eastern alcove and spent most of the afternoon there, reading from a volume of northern herbalism that used names she didn't recognize, for plants she did. She had learned plants from her grandmother in the hills. Before her grandmother died, and her father sold the house and bought a new cart and forgot to tell Win until she arrived at the old house to find strangers living in it. The book used the word Linhart for what she had always called winter time, and she spent an absorbing hour trying to reconstruct whether these were the same plant or two related ones, and for that hour she did not once calculate exits. The Alpha King found her there. He had not announced himself. She simply became aware of him, standing in the alcove entrance, holding a different book, and looking at the title of hers with an expression she would eventually understand was surprise, but in the moment registered only as unreadable. Herbalism, he said. Herbalism, she agreed. The northern classifications are different from the southern ones. He said it with the plain authority of someone making an observation, not managing a conversation. The Valdenmere tradition uses Linhart for what most territories call winter time. They're the same plant. The naming diverged in the third keeping. She looked at him. What? He said. I was trying to figure that out, she said, for an hour. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't quite pass. Not amusement, exactly, but something adjacent to it. He crossed to the shelf across from her, found what he'd come for, and left. She sat for a while looking at the space where he had stood, in the specific way of a woman trying to reconcile new evidence with a theory she'd already committed to. The theory, he is dangerous. Proceed accordingly. The evidence, he knew that Linhart and winter time were the same plant, and he had told her so instead of letting her spend another hour working it out alone. These two things were not, she was finding, easily held in the same hand. Lady Aldwyn Ferret arrived at Holnmark 3 weeks after Win, and from the moment she stepped into the great hall, Win felt the particular alertness she had developed over years of living with a man who was one thing to her face, and another thing entirely when he thought she was not watching. Lady Aldwyn was handsome, composed, and formally gracious, in the way of someone who has rehearsed graciousness and then become bored by the rehearsal. She was the senior lord of the Ferret territory, which abutted the northern Pact's eastern boundary, and her family had held that territory for 6 generations, and there were council members who believed, with historical basis, that a formal alliance between Holnmark and Ferret would be considerably more valuable than a mate bond to an unknown girl from a minor southern holding. Lady Aldwyn had not said this in front of Win. She had not needed to. What she had said in the garden, on the 3rd day after her arrival, "You must find this all very overwhelming." She said it warmly, her hand briefly on Win's arm. I imagine someone from your background would find the north very cold." "I grew up near the Alvath Hills," Win said. "It's cold there too." "Of course," said Lady Aldwyn, and changed the subject. That evening, Win moved her reading to a different corner of the library. She chose a chair that let her see both doors. She sat there with a volume of Northern Pack history balanced on her knees and thought about what Lady Aldwyn was building and how long she had been building it. And she had the same feeling she always had in houses where the walls were not as solid as they appeared. The feeling of cataloguing which surfaces she could trust and which she could not. She was still sitting there when Caelindor arrived with a small candle and a stack of council dispatches and settled at the table across from her without comment, as if they were simply two people who read in the same library in the evenings, which she supposed they were. She did not look up from her book. He did not look up from his dispatches. After a while he said, without preamble, "She comes here 4 times a year for the council review. She has been coming for 20 years. She has a legitimate claim to many concerns and an illegitimate use of most of them." He turned a page. "I wanted you to know she is not representative of how people here see you." She kept her eyes on her book. Of what, specifically? Of how people here see you, he said. She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He did not appear to require a response. They read across from each other until the candle burned down. She went to bed and lay awake thinking about unrequired acts, their specific texture, their cost, their historical reliability as a category, and could not sleep until well past midnight. On the 8th evening, after Lady Aldwyn's arrival, she and Caelindor were both again in the library, and she had been reading a northern chronicle that mentioned the third keeping, and she had eventually said, without entirely planning to, "Tell me about the third keeping." He looked up. "You mentioned it," she said. "The naming divergence." The third keeping was a period of significant reorganization after the Second Border War, he said. It lasted roughly 70 years. I was away for most of it. She looked at him. "Where were you?" He was quiet for a moment, deciding. There is a tradition in the Northern Pack, when the Alpha King is unmated, of a period of removal, isolation, in the deep northern ranges, when the wolf and the man reconcile the imbalance of living centuries without the bond. I went 3 times. The first time I was in the northern ranges when the naming tradition shifted. I came back, and everything was called something different. She thought about that for a while. Did you choose it? The isolation. No, he said simply. It was what the wolf needed. She had 100 questions and asked none of them. But she noticed before she closed her book for the night that the second cup on the table had been used. It had sat there clean and waiting for 3 weeks. Tonight it had been used. She closed her book and thought about that on the way to her room, turning it the way she turned unfamiliar objects. Carefully, looking for the weight of it. What she did not know and did not learn until later was that Lady Aldwyn had spent the weeks after her arrival sending messages. She had sent them to 3 of the pack's border lords. She had sent one, and this was the one that mattered, to Wyn's father. Her father arrived on a frozen morning in the 2nd month. Wyn was in the south garden when the gate bell rang, and she looked up and saw his cart coming through the arch, and she went still in the way of an animal that has heard a familiar sound and is deciding what to do about it. He came into the garden without invitation. He had grown thinner since she last saw him. The debt had not resolved itself. She could see it in the set of his jaw. The particular tightness of a man who has been told he still has something left to trade. "As Wyn," he said, with the warmth he deployed when warmth was useful. "You look well. Why are you here?" she said. Not a question. A tally, he told her. Lady Aldwyn's arrangement was financially significant and contingent on Wyn's cooperation. The cooperation required was not legal resistance to the Alpha King's claim. It was something more modest and considerably more dangerous. Public uncertainty. A woman who seemed unsure. A woman who asked, in front of witnesses, whether the bond was real. Wyn listened the way she tested locks. "No," she said. Her father's face went still. This was always the dangerous moment. "Wyn," he said, his voice going gentle and his hand coming to her arm, closing on the elbow in the way he had always done, fingers positioned to press against the nerve without leaving visible mark. "You don't understand what you're refusing." "I understand exactly what I'm refusing," she said. "Lady Aldwyn is prepared to be very generous to those who help her." The grip tightened. The precise incremental pressure he had always used to communicate how the conversation was expected to end. "And considerably less generous to those who don't. You have always been difficult. I have always been patient. I am simply asking you to be sensible." She was looking at his hand on her arm. She was cold, and the frost was heavy on the garden stones, and she could feel the familiar compression of the grip that had always worked, that had always eventually persuaded her that resistance cost more than it was worth. She was in the process of discovering, with the clarity of something that had been building for 3 months, that she did not believe that calculation anymore. "Take your hand off me," she said. He did not. "Take your hand off her." A voice behind him, quiet, absolute. Her father turned. Caelindor stood at the garden gate. He was not moving. He was not raising his voice. He was doing the specific thing he did when he was not asking, but stating, completely still, completely quiet, with the weight of a man who does not need to demonstrate it, to convey it. Her father released her arm. The conversation that followed was brief. The captain of the guard arrived at a brisk walk before it was over. Her father was escorted from the garden, from the yard, from the keep's grounds, with the particular efficiency of people who have been given clear instructions and are following them. He was gone within the hour. She did not watch him go. She stood in the cold garden, with her arm aching at the elbow, in the specific way it had ached, on and off, since she was 12 years old. Caelindor came to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He stood at his usual distance. The step and a half she had long since identified as a deliberate calibration, and said, without preamble or performance, "How long?" Not a question. An offer. "Long enough that it stopped being surprising," she said. "And then long enough that the absence of it became surprising instead." He was quiet. "The absence of it," she said more carefully, "has been difficult to trust." "I know," he said. They stood in the cold garden, and she was shaking slightly. From cold or from the spent weight of the confrontation, she wasn't certain. And he did not say anything else. But he was there, and the particular quality of his being there was the quality of a solid wall at her back in a room full of exits. She was no longer cataloguing. That evening she went to the library. He came later, as she had known he would. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, and she said, without preface, "Tell me about the bond, not the political version, everything." He told her. It took most of the evening. She learned about the boundary stones, how they required, at their root level, the resonance of the founding bloodline to maintain their integrity. How, without it, they did not fail at once but faded, the way fire reduces not to nothing, but to embers. How some of the furthest markers had gone entirely cold, and the animals that should not cross pack territory had been crossing more often. And 3 eastern villages had been reinforced at significant cost because the ambient protection had weakened to the point where human construction had to compensate for what the old stones no longer maintained. He also told her about the wolf. He said it the way one closes a document. Flat, plain, final. The bond was designed to be shared. The wolf's recognition instinct, the capacity to locate the bonded bloodline, does not stop operating without a mate. It simply redirects. It has been redirecting for 300 years. I stopped being able to name what that costs about a century ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your wolf chose me before you did." "Yes, and you didn't understand why." "I understood why," he said. "The bloodline, the bond, these were explicable." He paused. What I did not understand was the rest of it." "What rest of it?" "The particular quiet of a man formulating, not withholding. The first night I had the kitchen, arrange your room with the bed against the south wall, because the south wall is warmest in winter. It was practical. By the second week I had replaced the candles in the eastern alcove with the slower burning northern ones, because you stayed there longest, and the fast candles burned down before you finished. Also practical. A pause. By the third week, I had spoken to the head gardener about time, and he told me it cannot grow this far north, and I had spent a significant portion of an afternoon trying to determine whether the sheltered south quadrant might sustain it. And it was not, at that point, a practical decision. She looked at him. "What was it?" she asked. It was the only thing I could think to do," he said, very quietly. "I have been in the northern ranges 3 times for the isolation. I have lived in rooms furnished for dozens and used by one. I have been the most powerful man in this territory for 4 centuries. And I did not," he stopped, "chose differently. I did not know that it was possible to want to be in a room because someone else was reading in the corner of it." She felt the words settle somewhere under her sternum, in a place that had been quiet for most of her life. "That," she said slowly, "is the most honest dishonesty anyone has ever shown me. And I don't know whether to be grateful or furious, so I am both." He said nothing, but he also did not look away. His eyes were gold in the lamplight. The color they had been, she now understood, since the forecourt, here when his wolf had already known, and his centuries of learned caution were still trying to catch up. Outside the library windows, the winter advanced. The frost on the inner stone of Wynn's windowsill retreated each evening. When she was warm in the room and deepened each morning, when she was anxious, and she had been watching this pattern for weeks without mentioning it, the way she collected evidence in silence before deciding what it meant. The evidence had been accumulating alongside it, the warmth that lived very faintly in her sternum. Not pain, not illness, something older than either. Something that pulsed when she was near the boundary stones, or when the wind came from the north and carried with it the specific smell of deep pine and winter cold. She had pressed 2 fingers against it, the first time she noticed it, the way you press against a bruise to confirm it. It was warm under her fingers. It did not hurt. It had been there, she realized, for as long as she could remember, though she had not previously had a name for it, or a reason to attend to it. There was a night in the 2nd month when she woke to the castle bell ringing 3 sharp strikes, an emergency in the outer village. She dressed quickly and followed the household guard to the east gate because she had learned that following was more useful than waiting. A girl of perhaps 6, separated from her family's trading convoy, had wandered into the northern wood in the dark. She had been found by one of the village scouts, huddled at the base of a boundary stone that stood at the edge of packed territory. Old limestone, 4 centuries of weather, covered in grey-green lichen that she recognized without knowing why she recognized it. She walked to the stone without understanding why. She placed her palm against it. It was warm. Not the warmth of a stone that has recently been touched, but the warmth of something vast and slow breathing in its sleep. Pulsing, faint, intentional. The child was pressed against its base and was shivering less than she should have been. The scout looked at Wynn with an expression she could not read. She picked up the child. The warmth travelled with her, as if the stone had handed something off. The child stopped shivering entirely. Caelindor arrived at the gate 3 minutes later, moving fast, coat half buttoned, and stopped when he saw her standing in the torchlight, with the child asleep against her shoulder. He stood in the cold and looked at her for a long moment. At her face, cold-flushed and uncertain, and at the child, who was breathing steadily and was warm in a night that should have been beyond her. And she saw something happen in his expression that was too complex to read quickly enough before he controlled it. "You're cold," he said. "I'm fine." He crossed to her and put his coat around her shoulders over the child. It was heavy and warm and smelled of pine resin and old wool. She stood in it while the child's family arrived and took her, and stood in it for a while after, because he had moved a step back to give her room, and was not asking for it returned. And she was not ready to give back its warmth. The stone was warm, she said, when the yard had mostly cleared. I know, he said. Yeah, what was it? He looked at the old marker in the dark. Then, your bloodline is the reason we have been searching for 300 years. It is old enough to remember the pack's founding, and the stones at the boundaries were laid with that bloodline's specific resonance. The warmth you felt is the bond recognizing you. He paused. Your family does not know you carry it. I believe your grandmother knew, and kept it private. She stood with that for a moment. That, she said carefully, is the most honest dishonesty anyone has ever shown me. And I don't know whether to be grateful or furious, so I am both. He looked at her. Something that was not quite a smile moved in the corner of his mouth. The quality of a door that has been closed for a very long time, and has just, by some movement of the house around it, shifted slightly on its hinges. The council review came with the first hard frost of the 3rd month. Lady Aldwyn had been precise and thorough. The petition was reasonable on its surface. It requested that the selection's legitimacy be formally verified by a testing right recognised in pack law. Her argument, presented clearly and with the intelligence of a woman who had operated in courts for decades, was that the pack's stability required certainty, and certainty required documentation. She had not, in the petition, mentioned Wynn's father. She had not needed to. She had done what she always did, moved through systems rather than around them, used institutional language for institutional pressure, and let the weight of precedent do what direct confrontation could not. Wynn had spent the week before the review in the library, reading every volume available on Northern Pack law, mate bond protocols, and bloodline inheritance records. She had read them the way she read herbalism texts, with methodical attention, retaining everything, underlining nothing. She came into the great hall behind Caelindor on the morning of the review, wearing the dark wine gown that had appeared in her wardrobe 6 weeks earlier in her exact size, with no note attached and no source identified. Her hair was braided at her own preferred pressure. She had not asked who had measured her for the gown. She understood it as the kind of unrequired act that carried no debt, but a great deal of information. And she had added it to the catalogue she had been building for 3 months, salve by her plate, on the morning after a cold. Flowers replaced weekly in the corridor. She walked most, the slower candles in the eastern alcove, the time that would not grow. The hall was full. Lady Aldwyn sat at the centre of the council table, composed, her documents arranged with the precision of someone who has spent months preparing for one morning. Wynn sat to Caelindor's right. She listened and answered the formal questions directed to her plainly, without performance, in the pack law language she had spent a week learning well enough to use. She answered them with the specific honesty she had been told, once, was her most obvious failing. Then Lady Aldwyn stood and asked the question beneath all the procedural ones. In careful formal language, with the intelligence to frame it as concern for the pack, rather than personal interest. What does an unverified girl from a minor southern holding offer this territory that 4 centuries of proven alliance cannot? The hall was quiet. Wynn pressed 2 fingers to her sternum. The warmth was there. It had been there every day for 3 months, growing steadily easier to locate, like a fire building from embers. She stood. She walked to the north wall of the great hall, to the foundation stone that had been there before the hall was built around it. Old limestone, original, set at the pack's founding, with the specific resonance she now understood she had been carrying in her blood since the day she was born. She placed her palm flat against it. So the hall became very quiet, in the particular way of people who have stopped breathing simultaneously. The warmth travelled through the stone before any of them could be certain they were seeing it. A faint spreading luminescence at the edges of the old carvings, the kind of light that is not quite light, but that every person present would later describe, independently, as light. The frost on the window arches retreated. The temperature in the room shifted, not dramatically, but actually. A bodily thing that 40 people felt simultaneously in their bones. She kept her hand on the stone. She was frightened. She was frightened in the old, practiced way. The way of a woman who has learned, carefully, that drawing attention in rooms full of power tends to go badly. But she was also, and this was new, and she noted it with a kind of quiet precision, entirely finished hiding. Caelindor stood. His voice was quiet and final, carrying through the hall without effort. I believe the verification is complete. He looked at Lady Aldwyn, then at the council, then back. I was addressing my future queen. The hall was still. Lady Aldwyn gathered her documents with the grace of a woman who recognizes a conclusion and accepts it without losing her dignity. She inclined her head to Wynne. A genuine inclination, the gesture of someone who has fought honestly and understands that losing to a real thing is different from simply losing. She left the hall. Several council members went with her. Several remained. The ones who remained looked at Wynne not with the calculation of before, but with the specific attention of people who have just understood that something theoretical is real. Wynne took her hand from the stone. The warmth stayed, not in the stone, but in her. Settled, familiar, the temperature of a kept promise. That evening she went to the library, the chair with its back to the window, the shelf of northern herbalism, the smell of old parchment and pine smoke. These had become, over 3 months, her version of the crack in the plaster wall, something to hold when everything was moving. She noticed, sitting down, that she had not needed to hold anything in the same way for some time. He came later, as she had known he would. He settled across from her with his dispatches and his cup, and they read in the lamplight for a while. And she turned the page of her book and looked at the south window at the angle that let her see her room's inner windowsill. And the stone was clear, smooth and dry. No frost. The iron comb sat in its usual position on the ledge. She looked at him. He was watching her, with the attentiveness she had come, over months, to understand was not surveillance, but its opposite. The careful attention of a man who has learned that watching someone closely enough is a way of telling them they are worth being seen. In the northern ranges, she said, was there anything there, any reason to come back, other than the wolf's need? He was quiet for a moment. Then, there was a stone there, one of the furthest boundary markers. It had gone entirely cold. I told you, the stones fade without the bloodline. I used to sit beside it. For days. Sometimes. It had been warm once, and it had the memory of warmth, the way old stones carry the shape of what they've held. He looked at his hands. I came back 3 times from the ranges. Each time I sat beside that stone first. Each time I came back, I told myself I was coming back for the pack, for the council, for the work. A pause. I think I was coming back because I had not yet stopped believing the warmth would return. She felt something settle in her chest, final and precise. It returned, she said. He looked at her. The warmth, she said. It returned. The space between them was very quiet. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Over the scarred hand, the mark from the knuckle to the wrist, and left it there. He turned his palm up, not quickly, with the patience of someone who has learned to receive things carefully, so they do not break. I came here because my father sold me to pay a debt, she said. I am staying because I want to, and I need you to understand that those are 2 entirely different things, and the second one is mine, he said. I know. She said, "Good." Outside the library windows, the northern winter was very clear and very cold, and through the south glass she could see, at the right angle, with the lamp positioned as it was, the window of her room, and the inner ledge of the sill, and the stone, which was clear. No frost. The stone carried the warmth it had been holding for her all along. On the table between them, his second cup sat where the kitchen boy had left it, set out, without comment beside his, as it had been set out every evening for 3 months now. She picked up the tea. It smelled of mountain thyme. She held it for a moment. This small, warm, unrequired thing. This answer to a question no one had asked aloud. Then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The lamp burned steadily. The iron comb sat in its arrangement, on the windowsill of her room. The linen square was folded in her pack. The hill behind her grandmother's house was 4 territories south and covered in winter time, growing in the cracks of old stones, and she did not need to go back to it. She was, she thought, in the way of a person making an observation about something she had not noticed settling. Warm? Why, she did not check the lock before she went to sleep that night. She did not need to.